Enterprise Strategies Part 1, ISIS Server Arrays. I don't know if any of you have ever seen The Matrix, but there's a scene in there where Morpheus is trying to explain to Neo that his mind is a slave to a system and he's going to free his mind. Well, in this nugget, I'm going to free your mind because as of right now, we are a slave to the system of the standalone server, meaning a single server running firewall and cache features. So in this nugget, we're going to talk about expanding it, getting into the ISIS server schema and saying, you know what, we need to install new features in Active Directory to support an array of ISIS servers. We're also going to look at an enterprise server installation, what it looks like differently when we go from a standard version of ISIS server to an enterprise server. This also introduces a whole new layer of policies, and we're going to talk about that using tiered policies, enterprise and array policies alike. We're also going to dive into taking our old world, taking our minds as a slave and promoting them into the new array world, because as of now we have been configuring standard servers as a standalone edition. You don't have to rip off that server, uninstall it, and reinstall it. You can actually promote it, and we'll look at that. Finally, we'll get into managing arrays and what policies apply to specific servers, what applies to an array as a whole, and directly to individual servers. Now, if you think way back to the opening nuggets and pretty much the introduction to what ISIS Server was all about, we talked about the two different versions of ISIS Server. There was the Standard Edition and the Enterprise Edition. And in all the nuggets up till now, we have been working and using the ISIS Server Standard Edition. It works great if you install it on a single server, has firewall, caching features, pretty much everything ISIS Server offers, it can do. So why use ISIS Server Enterprise Edition? Well, here's why. They've added a few features. First off, it's scalable. It supports multi-processors, so you can distribute the load of ISIS Server between multiple processors inside of a computer. Along those lines, it supports load balancing. Here's the idea. ISIS Server Enterprise Edition allows you to combine multiple ISIS Server servers into a single management infrastructure. Using the load balancing capabilities, you can have all of the ISIS servers in your network responding to the same IP address. It's amazing because that way it not only will do load balancing, but it adds fault tolerance. If one of them goes down, your clients never know the difference. They just know they're going to the same IP address and somehow they're getting out to the internet. Now it also supports a protocol called CARP. Now it's not a fish. CARP is the Caching and Array Routing Protocol. What it does is it allows you to keep duplicate content from happening between your ISIS servers. You're going to have multiple ISIS servers, right? And maybe you'll have multiple caching servers. Well, they lose a lot of efficiency if they end up caching the same content. You're kind of it's almost just redundant at that point. So CARP will ensure that each ISIS server caches unique content, and that also distributes the load, kind of load balances between them with how much hard drive space the files eat up. On the management side of things, you get a new set of policies, enterprise versus array policies. And you know what? That's considered tier policy levels. I'm going to talk about that on the upcoming slide. For now, that's just one of the major features. Now, when you use ISIS Server Enterprise Edition, everything is stored in the Active Directory. That gives you easier management, it's replicated, it's backed up, and it's in that single infrastructure that we're all used to working with in Windows 2000 and 2003. So let's talk about this new tiered management that we have in ISIS Server Enterprise Edition. Well, first off, we have to think about the ISIS Server Standard Edition. How do we do things there? We've been using this for many of the nuggets up till now, and overall, the ISIS Server Standard Edition has all the policies within itself. Your packet filters are here, your protocol rules are here, your site and content rules, just about everything is assigned on the server. And that works great if you've only got one server, but when you have many of them, you have to graduate to this larger management infrastructure. Now you'll forgive me, I live in Arizona, so I drew these umbrellas from memory. We don't see rain often. In the ISIS Server Enterprise Edition, you have the enterprise level policies. These are going to be policies that affect the ISIS servers in your entire organizations. They can define site and content rules and protocol rules that affect every single ISIS server that you install anywhere in your network. These would have policies that maybe include things that would never be violated anywhere. For example, a site and content rule that filtered pornographic material, or a protocol rule that disallowed applications that you would never want used, like online games, inside of your network. These enterprise policies will affect every ISA server. But look at this. We also have array level policies. These are below the enterprise policy, as I tried to draw it right here. The array policies can further restrict the enterprise policy. For example, you might define an array policy for the accounting department, right? And in the accounting department, of course, they can't access pornographic material, but you also want to restrict them and say you can't access news websites as well, or you can't access search engines on the internet. So you can define site and content rules that further restrict them. They might say, well, is it possible for an array policy to override this? The answer is no. Make sure you remember that, because many people can get that confused. You cannot override an enterprise policy with an array policy. You can only further restrict it. Now, you can create as many enterprise policies and array policies as you'd like and apply them to the different parts of your organization. You could even have an array policy that only had a single ISA server underneath it. If maybe you had a unique ISA server for a certain department that had certain parameters that need to be defined for it. So that is how this new tiered policy setup works, and it'll make a lot of sense when we get into the live interface. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and start doing that now. I'm sitting on a new Windows 2000 server that is freshly configured, does not have ISA server installed. Now, I colored the background gray because we're going to start working on multiple ISA servers, and I want to make sure that you can distinguish which one is which. Now, this Windows 2000 server is special. It's in a domain. I've set it up in the nuggetlab.com domain, and I'm going to install ISA server on it because the process is a little bit different, and you'll start seeing where the enterprise and array policies start coming up. It's just the setup window like we saw in the installation nugget. And one of the things that you must do is now run the ISA server enterprise initialization. What this does is it installs the ISA schema into Active Directory. There's no way that this will be able to support storing enterprise and array level policies in Active Directory without changing the schema. Now, you do have to be a member of the schema admins or enterprise admins to do this, and it does mention this is not reversible. You might know that when you change the Windows 2000 or 2003 schema in Active Directory, you can't unchange it. You can't go back without totally restoring Active Directory from a backup. So make sure you know what you're doing and you've checked this with the authorities that be. We'll go ahead and click Continue, and it comes up with the enterprise initialization. What this does is it wants us to specify how our policy infrastructure, how the tiers are going to work out. It's going to ask us, do you even want to use an enterprise policy? Because if not, you can choose to use an array policy only. Smaller networks might be okay with this because an array policy is a single policy, or you can define multiple arrays, that applies to multiple ISA servers. That allows you some different flexibility from a single installation because each server had its own settings before. But if you do want an enterprise policy, you can create one now. Now, don't worry, you can always create more later, but we'll go ahead and name the first one. Let's name it CBT Enterprise. Nothing to do with Star Trek. I'll go ahead and check this box because this allows the array level access policies that further restrict this. If you do not check this, the array levels are kind of helpless against the enterprise. The enterprise is the one that rules all. Now, you also have the ability to restrict publishing rules. This is a pretty big one because if you leave it unchecked, nobody can publish anything without you knowing about it. That, for an enterprise level administrator, is a good thing because you ensure that people do not make ports available and holes through the firewall without you knowing about it. You also have the ability to force packet filtering in the array as well. Remember, the person that is setting this up is the one that affects the entire enterprise. They're going to be the one that pretty much allows and disallows what the arrays, the lower level arrays, can do. So I'll go ahead and click on OK. Now, this may not go through completely because I have installed this before in the pre-recording show to make sure that this worked correctly. Now, this will update the ISA server schema. It will take some time, so I'll go ahead and pause the video. When this is done, we'll be ready to install the entire ISA server. Okay, the ISO Server Enterprise initialization has finished running. We've updated the schema in our entire domain. And just a note, it does take some time to replicate that new schema to all your domain controllers. Depending on how many domain controllers you have and how your replication is configured in Windows 2000 or 2003 is really the determining factor until all the domain servers get it. Now once that happens, I'm going to install the ISO server, and it's virtually the same process. It's going to be walking through, and I'll kind of hit the high points, but overall there's going to be one screen that's going to change, and I want to show you which one that is. First thing it asks for is my CD key. I'll go ahead and type in the demo CD key that Microsoft gives us, 880-448-6634. Click on OK. It's going to search for the installed components. Now, the main thing that's going to be different is that as it comes up, it's going to ask us, what sort of array are you going to install this into? As you notice, it says, do you want to install this as an array member? If you click no, the server will be installed as a standalone server. Okay, this is one of the major differences, is you now have the option. If your server is not installed into a domain, this will not pop up. All the ISO servers have to be installed into the same domain and the same site if they're going to participate in the same array. So I'll go ahead and say, yes, I am going to install this as an array member, and it's going to allow us to name this new array. What you'll usually do is name the arrays after the locations they're in, because typically the primary strategy is to create an array for every major location or every major policy set that you want to apply to the ISO servers. So we'll go ahead and say this is the accounting array. All the ISO servers supporting the accounting department, and imagining that the accounting department is quite large. It's going to come up, and this is the main screen I was talking about. It's going to ask us, with this ISO server, do you want to use the default enterprise policy settings? And that means the settings we just set a moment ago when we installed the ISO server schema. Or do you want to create your own policy settings and allow you to say, you know what, I want to just use my array policy, or I want to go ahead and use the enterprise policies that we've defined. Now, if you've defined more than one, it will go ahead and let you restrict those right there. And this is pretty much allowing you to set custom rules for this array. For now, I'm going to click on Use the Default, and that will import the policies, as I mentioned, from the schema that we set just a moment ago. That's the default policies that applies to the array as a whole. Now it's going to take us to the screen with the firewall, the cache, the integrated mode. Something I want to mention to you. Make sure that you install all of the ISO servers that are in the same array, in the same mode. The reason why is the array will have policies that apply to caching, to firewall, to the integrated mode, and if you don't have them installed the same way, you're going to have some policies that might apply to some servers and other policies that will not apply, and you'll have some discontinuity in that configuration. So overall, I usually choose integrated mode for just about all of my installs unless I have a very large network and a very specific reason not to. The rest of this installation process is going to be exactly the same as it is in the Firewall Nugget. So I'm going to pause this recording, walk through the rest of this behind the scenes, and then show you what the results look like. Well, the installation is finished, and I went ahead and opened the ISO Management Console. You'll instantly notice something new. We now have the Enterprise section and the Servers and Array section. Oh, sorry, I got to get out of that taskpad view. Under the Enterprise, we notice that we have policies and policy elements just like we did before, and this is the policy that we defined when I set up the schema, CBT Enterprise. Under there, we have the two rules that I mentioned the Enterprise allows, the site and content rule that applies to the whole enterprise, and the protocol rules. These policy elements are also defined for the enterprise as a whole, so they can apply to these enterprise policies. Now if I expand the servers and arrays section and look under there, you notice it no longer says the name of our server. Before, when we were using the standard edition of Enterprise Server, it just said ISO Server, which was the name of my server. Now it says Accounting, and if I expand it out, it looks very similar to the standard edition, except now it'll list what servers are in there underneath here. 2000 Server happens to be the name of the server with the gray background. And I could add more servers to this array. So here's a dilemma. What if you've installed an ISIS server as a standalone server. You install it with the enterprise setup, but you set it up as a standalone server because maybe you didn't have a large enough network yet. Does this mean you have to completely remove ISIS server from the old one and reinstall it to add the new ISIS server? Well, actually, they have made a much easier way. So what I want to do is I want to take us back to our old ISIS server that we've been using up till now in this section and bring it in to this new policy. Let's walk over to that computer right now. Okay, I'm back on the ISIS server that we've been working with in all the nuggets up till now. It's that nice black comforting background. Now, before we get into the full-blown movement of this server into the array, let me show you a few things. I'm going to expand the ISIS server management console and expand the servers in array, and this will act as a good review. This is the single ISIS server that we've been working with up till now. Notice the icon. It's a little green box with a single computer sitting in front of it. This icon means that it is a standalone server, and all of these policies that we've been defining up till now are somewhat self-centered. They only apply to this one server. Now, before I am able to move it into the array, I need to show you something right here. I'm going to go to the properties of my computer and show you that I have made this server a member of the nuggetlab.com domain. Until you make it a member of a domain, more specifically the domain that you want to put it in, the promote option will not even appear. What promote option? Well, when you right-click on the server, you will have this option to promote it into an array. Now, a note, if you do this, you cannot go back. It's one thing to promote a server into an array, but to get it out, you'll actually have to tear off the ISIS server, uninstall it completely before you can reinstall it as a standalone server. And that's what this warning is telling you. So I'll go ahead and click on yes, and while I'm waiting, not long, what happens to all of the policies that are sitting on this server? I mean, we've been defining tunneling policies for VPNs. We've been defining packet filters, publishing rules. What happens to them all? Well, most of them will be kept, hopefully. Keep your fingers crossed, because we are given the option right here of what sort of enterprise policy we want to use. Now, when we bring this into the array, and I shouldn't say bring into the array, when we create an array for this server, the policies will be maintained as far as they don't conflict with the enterprise policy. Remember I told you that the enterprise policy sets kind of the organization restrictions? Well, arrays cannot contradict that. And if there's any policies in this array that do contradict the enterprise policy, they will be removed as it's promoted. ISIS server, or I should say the array, will be created for this single ISIS server. It will create an array named right after it, and all the policies that do not conflict with the enterprise policy will move over. Now, we are given the option here to use the custom enterprise policy, and we can again define all those options that we did during the install, during the schema promotion, or we can go ahead and use the default policy. And these are the ones that we defined when we installed the ISIS server schema. We'll go ahead and leave it at that. I'll click on OK. This is going to take probably about 2 to 3 minutes. Overall, what it's doing is it's moving all the policies that I have on this ISIS server into an array that it's creating right now named after this ISIS server. I'll go ahead and pause the recording while this process takes place. Then we'll come back and take a look at what's happened. Okay, check this out. We've promoted the server, and it is now telling us it's promoted. To configure it, go ahead and connect to the enterprise. Here's the idea. Now that we've done it, I'll go ahead and click on OK. Notice the servers and arrays. I expand it, and nothing is there. Our server has disappeared. It has joined the enterprise. So what we need to do is right-click on ISIS server, the management console. I'll hit Connect To, and we have the option of a standalone server. Well, there is none anymore. Or to the enterprise and arrays. I'll click on OK, and notice it doesn't even ask me which enterprise, because the only enterprise we can manage is the one that our domain is representing. This is pretty much the domain of the ISIS servers. All right. Now, under here, we have the enterprise settings that we've had before, the policies, CBT Enterprise. And by the way, I'm still on our Windows 2003 server with a black background. I haven't jumped back over to the Windows 2000 server. Since this is just a snap-in, I can manage anything, anywhere in my domain. I expand the servers and array, and I now see a new array. And the reason I pointed out the little single server icon is, look at it. It looks like a server, but it's not. There's two servers right next to each other. When you move the ISA server into the enterprise settings, into the arrays, it will create one for it. And it will put all of the settings for that ISA server, or the ones that it had that didn't contradict the enterprise policy, right underneath here. So under here, if I click the computers, notice this is where my ISA server went. This is in addition to the Windows 2000 server that is sitting under the accounting array. So now we have two separate arrays with two different servers underneath. One of the first questions that people ask when I show them this demo and I say, hey, you know what, this is our two arrays that we have now. People think, oh, well, I'd like to consolidate that. I'd like to move the ISA server from this array over here into accounting. And if you don't know, you'll sit here trying all sorts of things, right-clicking, hitting properties, dragging and dropping. Here's the tip, though. Once you install a server into an array, it's there for good. The only way that you can move a server from one array to another, for instance, to take this ISA server out and move it into the accounting array, would mean to uninstall ISA server from this computer and reinstall it, and then when it comes up with the option as what array would you like to be a member of, then you would choose the accounting array. Now the initial thought is, wow, that seems really silly. I mean, that seems odd. Well, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. Moving a server to an array means you're totally stripping off what that server is. All of these policies that we have assigned, anything that is assigned under this array is ripped away from that server. It's just like uninstalling a server. So the way Microsoft configured it is that you would need to uninstall the server before you can move it to a different array. That's how we can manage our servers in what arrays they're installed into. I'll go to minimize this and get into the enterprise policies. Let's talk about these for a little while because there can be some confusion. When I said enterprise policy before, people think, okay, you have this policy, in this case, CBT Enterprise, that applies to the entire organization. True? Well, that is true right now. There's only one of them. It is considered the default policy. I right-click on it, and you notice the Set as Default Policy. But we can create multiple policies. Maybe you have an organization that's huge. I mean, imagine Intel or Motorola, an organization of that size. And you have huge enterprise departments. I mean, some departments that are larger than the majority of companies. You can create multiple enterprise policies. I'll go ahead and create a second policy, and we'll say this is for the marketing organization. Because maybe your marketing organization is so large that you need a complete enterprise policy because there's multiple arrays underneath it. Now we have dual policies. And really, this gives us the option of saying, you know what, I want marketing organization to apply to a certain set of arrays and the CBT enterprise to apply to others. Notice we have the little checkbox. That means it's the default. So whichever one you set as the default will be inherited by any arrays that don't explicitly define what enterprise policy they'd like to use. So here's a question. How would I assign the marketing organization policy to some arrays and CBT enterprise to others? Well, what you do is you go to the properties of whatever array you'd like to modify. And it has the Arrays tab up here. The arrays allow you to select which array you would like this enterprise policy. Now notice this note. It says, unsetting the checked array will set the array to use the default CBT enterprise policy. Meaning that if you don't explicitly set these, and if we even look at the CBT enterprise, you'll notice they're not explicitly set, because CBT Enterprise is the default. So anything that is not explicitly assigned to something else will inherit CBT Enterprise policies. As for configuring the array policies, you can configure them however you'd like. If you expand them, you'll notice you only have site and content rules and protocol rules. These are the rules that I mentioned before, and configuring these are exactly the same as configuring the array policies or the server policies in the previous nuggets when we talked about configuring the different rules. So I don't want to get into that because it is repetitive information. Let's delve into the array policies themselves. By configuring ISA Server for the enterprise setup, you gain a lot of functionality both at the enterprise level and at the array level. Now, I want you to imagine this. Imagine that Instead of having just 2 arrays here, we had 10 or 50 or 100. You're with an organization that has multiple locations around the world, each one of them equipped with its own ISA server, its own network administrator, and that sort of thing. And I'm talking an organization the size of like an Intel or a Motorola, just a huge company. You as an enterprise level administrator can define as many enterprise policies as you need. I mean, whatever the requirements for your company are, maybe one set of 50 divisions has this enterprise policy, another set has this enterprise policy. You can define them however you'd like. When you get down to the server and array level, you can define your sub-administrators. And these are people that have the power over just their array. For the accounting division, you could go ahead and say, and there's a network administrator that pretty much sees when they open their ISA management console, they see just the accounting array, and they can configure the policies for that array if you allow it. See, here's the power that you have as an enterprise level admin. You can go to the properties for the accounting. And remember, all of this can be restricted. That's what this security is. That's the power of having this installed inside of Active Directory. Just like in Windows 2000 and 2003, you can go ahead and set restrictions as to what sub-level administrators can access. But let's focus on this policies area. For the accounting department, you as an enterprise level admin get to define what enterprise policy they will use. You get to allow the sub-administrator, if you want to create additional policy rules that restrict the enterprise policy. Now, be careful when you read that because it's misleading. Some people think, oh no, I'm restricting what the enterprise policy can do. That's not how you want to read that. This is to further restrict the security in addition to the enterprise policy. I've said many times, you can't override what you set at the enterprise level. However, you can choose whether you even want to allow a sub-administrator to restrict that. Now maybe the accounting department doesn't have any internal servers. Well, you know what? I'm not going to let that internal administrator for the accounting department create any publishing rules, because without my knowledge, I should not have an administrator publishing servers. That decreases my security for that accounting division. We also have the ability to force packet filtering, in essence saying, lower level administrator, you must be secure. You cannot turn off packet filtering for your array because that would be a security breach. So this is the power that you have as an enterprise level admin, and you can do that for each and every array that you have defined for you. It does mention when you choose not to allow publishing rules, it will wipe out any publishing rules that exist. Do you want to continue? That's right, we will, because sub-level administrators shouldn't be defining those anyway. So that's the idea. That's how we can go ahead and restrict each and every array. Now there are some properties that are kept between the arrays and between all of the computers inside of the array. Now you would usually have more than just a single server in each array. You probably have 2 or even 3 for fault tolerance and load balancing, but in this case we have 1. Now there are things in the array that applies to all computers. For example, if I went in here and defined a site and content rule, and I said, you know what, I want to say that nobody can access this certain website, that would apply to all of the servers in the array. Same for protocol rules. Same for most things in here, but there are some specific features that apply to individual array servers. For example, the cache configuration. Now, as a whole, the cache configuration applies to everything. You can pretty much set your source expiration. You can set your FTP expiration, active caching. These policies apply to all the servers. However, you can define unique drives for each server. For instance, maybe you had one server that had a larger hard drive than most. Well, what you could do is say, I want to have that one store 5 gigabytes of cache space while the others store 1 gigabyte. That is on a per server basis. Now you can set alerts per server. You might remember in the monitoring and reporting nugget, we talked about the different alerts that you could set. You can set alerts per server. So I can say, I want that server to alert me when it's out of hard drive space. I want that server to alert me when it gets intrusion detection attacks. That allows you to be very flexible as to what server will alert you for what features. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have them all alert you for the same thing. That's fine. It's just an option for you. You can specify publishing rules per server if the enterprise policy allows you to. This is a good thing. Imagine if you made an internal web server available. I mean, if you set a publishing rule and it applied to all servers, that means port 80 on every single one of your servers are instantly opened. That's not a good thing. Now, notice here, if I right-click on Web Publishing Rules, is something missing? Yes, it is, the new option. Because the enterprise policy has limited this. It actually removes the option completely to create a new publishing rule. So overall, if it lets you create publishing rules, you could define it per server. Now you can also configure packet filters under the access policy area. The packet filters can be configured on a per server basis. It allows you to define what servers has what ports open. So you can say this packet filter is for everybody or just one server. Finally, you can define listeners per server. Now listeners define what port numbers each server will listen to. I'll right-click on the accounting array, hit Properties, and you notice for the outgoing and incoming requests, you can configure either the same listeners for all internal IP addresses and pretty much on all servers, or you can define per IP address. Now this is on the incoming side. I'll click on Add, and you notice it lets me pick what server do you want to apply this listener to, then what IP address on that server, and pretty much this is talking about defining port numbers that the ISO server listens to and authenticates users with. That can be defined per server inside of your array. So in this first enterprise nugget, I hope I have freed your mind from the slavery of the standalone installation and expanded it to include the new enterprise strategies. First off, we talked about how the ISO server schema fits into things, how to install it into the Active Directory, and starting to manage this through an Active Directory style of tiered policies. That's the second method that we looked at. Enterprise versus array policies, what each means, who can manage both, and what they apply to. We looked at promoting a standalone server, so you don't have to pretty much neglect those, uninstall them, and reinstall them into a new system. You can promote them into the enterprise and allow them to be managed under your enterprise policies. Finally, we looked at managing the arrays. Which policies apply to all computers in the array, and which policies can be defined per server. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.